Food is fun, food is fundamental, food is far-reaching, food is fearful. These four general terms do actually encapsulate some of the most important characteristics related through research, primarily from social scientists, in trying to understand more than anything else the meanings associated with food. Without any doubts, in the case of Malta, one of the main foods associated with the island itself is the long-standing history of Fenkata, otherwise the consumption of rabbit. What I would like to do with you today is, more than anything else, is have a quick tour de force through some of the salient aspects related to the history of Fenkata, rabbit, in Malta, primarily emphasizing aspects related to 17th and 18th century history, but also having an opportunity to get closer to us in a way that it would be possible for us to explore different aspects and meanings associated with rabbit and their persistence in Maltese culture, particularly in the way that the Maltese have managed to generate meanings associated with this particular food. Allow me to start off by drawing your attention to this 1551 map by Lafreri, and the reason why I want to use this is because I need to start off by saying something related to the geography of rabbit and rabbit hunting here in Malta. Well, the archives provide us with ample evidence related to Boschetto, the Rabat area, where rabbit hunting is known to have happened for a very long time, and we also, through the documents, find evidence that indicates that from time to time, rabbit hunting in this area was reserved exclusively for the Knights of St. John. There again, especially in periods of hunger, the restrictions on the hunting of rabbit had sometimes ruffled feathers, particularly among the Maltese, who also considered rabbit hunting as a source of meat, in some cases only source of meat, but especially in times of hunger, it was an alternative food. So therefore, the Rabat area was one of the areas within which a lot of hunting used to happen. But then there's also the area of Meliha, primarily the region around the Torre Lahmar, the Red Tower, but also Salmoon. In both cases, we have evidence that indicates that there are a lot of hunting, rabbit hunting in particular, happened within the area itself. But then Lafreri again has this interesting illustration where even the island of Comino is geographically also positioned in such a way that it's given its importance also through a number of rabbits found on it. Well, incidentally, this is something which is not unique to the period of the Knights of St. John, but it also keeps on being the case even into the British period, because we also have evidence indicating that rabbit hunting in particular years was the exclusive prerogative of the British, primarily the British high-ranking class, where Comino itself had become the hunting ground for rabbits. That being said, of course, Comino continues to this very day to have its connection with rabbits to the extent that we have still a geographical feature on Comino itself known as Il Beit al-Fene. Yeah, I'm not sure whether you've ever noticed, this is an image of Imjar and the parish church of Imjar. The reality is also one where it seems that history does repeat itself. It seems like, things have transcended to a point where if rabbit hunting was associated primarily with the northern part of Malta, or at least the evidence that we have is mainly associated with the north of Malta, it seems that even through time, this had got to a point where even some of the popular restaurants that serve rabbit as a prepared food are also located in the northern part of Malta. So it's quite interesting how the evidence from historical archives can actually also give us information on how to put together the foodscape of the island. Now, going back a little bit to the 18th century, we also know that there were times when particular attention had been given to the number of the rabbit population here on island. And so consequently, as a result of that, there had been from time to time regulations put into place to actually prohibit or otherwise the hunting of rabbits. What's really interesting is that particularly as a result of research conducted by Professor Karma Kassar and his publication in 1994 of Fenkata, an emblem of peasant resistance, Kassar also came to the conclusion that as a result of the Dema and the organization of the Dema by the Knights of St. John, a number of men had actually been provided with the necessary firepower, a rifle, gunpowder, and a musket, gunpowder and a bullet to actually not only defend the island against the enemy, but from time to time to also practice, target practice on rabbits. So, this could, it is a hypothesis, but it's a plausible argument by which that could have increased the element of rabbit hunting on island. However, that being said, one also have to keep in mind that apart from hunting, rabbits could also be trapped using a snare and a ferret. Well, here we have a very interesting representation coming from Zemelli. This is an 18th century representation where this is a little bit more than just a casual conversation between the forces of order and the rabbit hunter. Also of particular interest is not just the rabbit itself, but also the dog, which we will say something very briefly in a minute. And here is the detail of that same representation. Well, one asks the question, of course, why this representation? Well, immediately you start to come to particular conclusions, especially with the fact that the artist itself is actually precipitating towards this representation because it had a particular meaning to the people of the time. So again, the importance of rabbit comes about in this regard, also represented to us through this representation. But of course, I need to draw your attention again to the dog, because this is the Pharaoh's hound, in Maltese capital Fenek, which has been always associated with Malta, and an earliest reference to it comes down to us through Gianfrancesco Bella, who refers to the dog as Czerneki, a dog that has been valued particularly for rabbit hunting. And we know of its slim build, but of course we also know of its agility. Therefore, it made it a very good candidate in the purpose of rabbit hunting itself. But again, here we have a more modern representation of the gentleman on our right-hand side. It seems that things have changed very little. For those who are wondering where this place is, well, this is not actually Malta. This is actually Sicily. So this also, brings us aware and makes us aware that rabbit hunting and the consumption of rabbit is not something which is exclusive to Malta. In fact, we find that rabbit hunting was very common in different parts of the Mediterranean. What I would like to share with you now is another very important document, an 18th century document by Ajus de Soldanis. In fact, this is one of the famous dialogues of Ajus de Soldanis that also refers to rabbit hunting in Malta, but also in Gozo. And this is one of the sides of the same dialogue between a peasant and a hunter. What's really interesting is that they give us some very interesting insights to the situation at the time when de Soldanis penned the same document. The first question is where are you heading to? And the hunter is actually giving us an indication that this particular hunter was not using a musket to hunt the rabbit, but the hunter is actually using the ferret. In other words, this is a snaring approach by which snares are located in the openings of different burrows, and then a ferret is released to chase the rabbit out of the same burrow in the hope that the rabbit will be snared. So the first indication that we have here is, unlike the images on either side of the same document, here we are not using a musket, but this particular case is another type of rabbit trapping. The other thing which is quite interesting is an indication of quantities. In fact, the gentleman is informing the rabbit hunter that already someone has passed with at least 50 rabbits. What's also quite interesting is that we are given evidence of the place from where the hunting had happened. And here we have a reference to Tor al-Ahmar. So again, the area of the northern part of Malta. The other element that is also quite interesting is this hope that maybe rabbits are brought to an end. Reason why is because this farmer is extremely concerned about the rabbit population, how the rabbit population was causing a lot of trouble to farmers because these same rabbits were actually eating on, they were grazing on crops that were cultivated by these farmers. So apart from the fact that it was already difficult to cultivate crops, among other things because of the nature of our fields and the quantity of rainfall, then on top of that you also had to deal with rabbit infestations that would actually eat up the produce. So in this particular excerpt, we are being told that something needs to be done so that rabbits would stop destroying agricultural productivity. Here, last but not least, it is also giving us an indication related on how the land is being destroyed because of the consumption itself of the rabbit over agricultural produce. Now, this part is mainly, part of it is going to be dealing with rabbit consumption. I think we need to share a little bit of information here. This tile coming from Palazzo Falzon. It's not a Maltese representation. In all probability, it's civilian. But that being said, it is a very interesting image that one could also associate with the case of Malta, because a lot of butchering happened at home. Once the animal was prepared to be consumed, there were different ways of how rabbit could be prepared. I'm sharing here with you a very interesting cooking implement. In Maltese called al-ba'ra, pipkin in English. Well, basically the purpose of it was that you could prepare, among other things, rabbit stew. So where the handle on top is located, that's actually a lid that comes off. The person would put in the sauce and the meat into the pipkin. The lid is put back into its place. The perimeter of the lid is sealed with water and flour so that nothing gets to contain as much as possible the steam from leaving the pipkin from the perimeter of the lid itself. The entire pipkin would then be buried in the ground, in the sense that first the person would have had to dig a rather shallow hole in the ground. Then you'd start a fire using wood or charcoal, and then on the embers, once that the fire dies, the pipkin is located straight on top of the embers, and the entire pipkin is covered with dirt. leaving the stout that is sticking out, the head-like object that is sticking out of the bara, because while the process is happening, the stout would allow the release of steam from the pipkin itself. So this is an indicator that rabbit was prepared as a stew. Also, we have a recipe that dates back to 1894. It's actually the first recipe. This is the first published recipe book that we know so far, published in Maltese. Ktib by E.L. Vella, published 1894, and here we find a reference to Fenkata Campagnola. Two very interesting things. This is a book, a recipe book that was written to prepare the young ladies who were going to be employed with the high-ranking British officers here in Malta in their homes. Of course, the British officers seems to have been interested in having a taste of what Malta was all about. And there you go, you would prepare, among other things, one of the dishes that apparently is very closely associated with Maltese culinary culture. And not only that, but as La Campagnola, it is referring to a dish that is primarily consumed, at least in 1894, by the people of the countryside. Maybe this is also associated with the northern part of Malta and the hunting aspect related to a rural more than an urban form of meat consumption. But what's also important in this particular recipe is the reference to potatoes. So here again, we are talking about culinary culture that is evolving even with regards to rabbit consumption itself. Another very interesting fragment of information comes down to us through this carnival float. This is primarily a reaction to a comment that happened in 1930. It was also published by the Daily Malta Chronicle, actually referring to the Maltese as people who do rear a lot of rabbits, particularly at home. Not only that, but rabbits were also mentioned during the visit of a very important agricultural advisor, Australian agricultural advisor by the surname of Potts, who was actually in England, and after doing his services there, on his return to Australia, he stopped here in Malta, and the governor had actually taken an opportunity to get him to analyze a little bit the situation, the agricultural sector here in Malta. And of course, he didn't really have very positive comments about the agricultural sector here. Among other things, he remarked that it seems like the island, or at least the farmers, have never heard that there was an industrial revolution that was happening around the world. And so the Maltese, from a satirical point of view, didn't sit back and watch and listen, but they actually came up with, in fact, in this particular carnival, there are at least 3 floats which are related to food. What is very much interesting to us is, apart from the chefs and the children dressed up as bunny rabbits and the pagna, here we have, again, another representation of how rabbit could be prepared. In this case, it could be a stew, but it also could be fried. So these are the 2 most popular representations, at least from a cultural point of view, that the Maltese associate with rabbit preparation. I know it doesn't really show very well, but behind the 2 chefs is also what Maltese call the canoe, which is a countryside stove, which is a stove that you can locate anywhere within your home, and again, it is a beautiful representation of culinary practices here in Malta. But rabbits were also quite important during the war. In fact, one of the leading advisors for the Ministry of Food in London, Drummond, was actually sent to Malta, and in June 1942, he actually writes up this report. It was actually a secret report. There was a lot of detail in it that could have got the British government into a lot of trouble, but among other things, there was a lot of detail which the Brits were not interested in allowing that to go into the hands of the enemy. But he estimated that that in Malta one could find approximately 300,000 heads I know that might sound to be a big number, but when you think of a population of 270,000, technically speaking, that is not a lot. However, that being said, it's again an indication that rabbits continued to be part of Maltese cultural identity. What's also really interesting is it's actually a funny document that we have here in front of us. It's actually a report of a gentleman who had just ordered a stew, and that is why it's so important for us, because here we have again another indication of how rabbit gets to be prepared. But this gentleman unfortunately noticed that there was a rather longish tail also included in his plate. There and then he decided to actually feed what supposedly was a rabbit to the dog. In all probability here we're talking about a cat. And even though we're still talking about 1941, which of course is not the year when Malta suffered dire hunger, one could imagine why this gentleman actually reported the chef for providing him with something that was not eatable. Well, of course, we cannot talk about rabbit and not mention Imnaria, which is a very important national feast in Malta. But the reason why I'm putting this up is primarily because of two reasons. To start with, there's a very strong possibility that the pipkin was used as a way of how people could prepare the meats and all the necessary ingredients for the stew in the pipkin itself, and then the entire pipkin was sealed and carried to Boschetto, where eventually a fire was prepared and then left to boil on the embers for 2, 3 hours, 4 hours while the merrymaking happened, and thereafter people could eat and drink wine. But there's also another possibility that here we're also referring to another way of how to actually prepare food for the Boschetto event, and that is by preparing the rabbit meat into a pie. The reason why I'm saying this is because we have always been associated in so many different ways with the different preparations of Fenkata. So if you had to ask a Maltese person what is Fenkata, they would all immediately tell you that this involves rabbit. But we seem to have lack of agreement on what this Fenkata is. Is it a stew? Should it be fried? Should we put potatoes in it? Should we put fries in it? These are all interesting questions that people ask. Should we take E.L. Vella's recipe as the first one since it's documented? Well, technically speaking, one of the earliest references that comes down to us is again thanks to Professor Conor Kassar, who in 1533 records how Stagno, a Napoleon painter, was reportedly inquisitor for actually consuming pistizzi, carne di lepre, which is pretty much a pie made up of wild rabbit meat. There again, the question is, which one should we go for? Should we go for the pie? I know this is not a Maltese representation, but this is a meat pie by Kleitz. And so is this what we should be going for? Or should we, or do we need to decide what people term to be traditional Fenkata? These are philosophical debates, hypothetical questions, but maybe we need to come to an agreement to the fact that culinary culture is something that gets to be borrowed, that gets to be shared, that is alive, that changes through time, and therefore rather than wasting time thinking about simply how to prepare it, we could also spend some time thinking about how to use local product, how to reduce food waste, and among other things, how to continue to sustain our research so that we could further understand Malta's culinary past. Thank you.